Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Azure podcast. I'm your host, Evan Baslick, and we are recording today on August 31st, episode number 437. We'll be talking with James Tabor of the Azure Customer Experience, Customer Reliability Engineering team about the low-code automation that he's doing to help run, he's the same team as me, to actually run our business with some of this low-code automation, like actual Azure incident management. I've got Kale and Sajit with me here as well, and obviously, our special guest, James. But before we get to James, let's talk about news.
Sure, I'll go first. This is Kale. I got 4 of them here today, so I'll go kind of quickly here. The first one is around Grafana. So for anybody who's a fan of the Grafana dashboards and telemetry type tools, you might not be aware, but we have a managed Grafana that's now generally available. So this was just announced along with some new connections and integrations for Azure. The ones that stood out here were like things like Azure Monitor. So personally, I find when working with Grafana, like building those dashboards is probably the hardest part, right? Like once you have those things built and then you have your connections, it's relatively easy to get these things connected. So having some new dashboards out of the box built for Azure Monitor is awesome. And there's some stuff with load balancing for the network insights, other kind of features in there for container apps and things like that. Pretty cool stuff. The second one, I feel like I should work for these guys because I always bring it up on podcasts, but the cost management updates.
We need to have them on. I don't know that we've ever had cost management folks on the show.
I think a long ways back, they weren't even called cost management. I think,
yeah.
But yeah, I always bring this up because they're pretty diligent about publishing their updates, and it seems pretty much monthly. But they have some new stuff out here. A couple that stood out for me for the enterprise specifically were things like the MCA billing for your Microsoft customer agreements. You're able to kind of associate those tenants in there now and manage them through there. Whole slew of new things around the desktop as a service. There's actually like a labs now too. I didn't realize this. Maybe I missed this a while back, but there's a cost management labs now where you can basically get pre-beta or like beta releases of new things that are coming up, so you can apply to be part of those. And there's a whole list of like things that are in those previews, which is pretty cool. So they're actually growing quite a bit over there in the cost management space. 2 other ones. One was around, this was associated with Mobile World Congress, but the mobile space. This year, we announced the Azure Private 5G Core, which is part of the MEC, the private MEC that's part of Azure for the Edge. So this works with Azure Stack for these private network enterprises and mobile operators that are using these. Growing like crazy. Lots of quotes in here from even Satya about how this is basically allowing the extension to these local markets from the cloud. So the cloud's actually helping grow the local market as a result of these offerings being there. It's pretty cool. And the last one I had was around Azure Virtual Machines for this Ampere Ultra ARM-based processors, basically, or GA. I think we announced that a while back, but they will be GA. Actually, we're recording this on August 31st. They're slated to be GA on September 1st in 10 regions, I believe. And these are, cost-effective kind of ARM processors that can be used. Different SKU numbers. I'll have to see what they are. I think they're called like DP and EP. Yeah, DPS and LS and then the EPs. So take a look at those. They have various sizes that are available there for these ARM-based processors. That's it.
Nice. Sajit, you want to hit yours?
Yeah, I got 3 of them. I know we have quite a few updates this week, but 3 that I was kind of excited about. One is with regards to Cosmos DB. That sometimes if you make queries in Cosmos DB, they can be expensive, right? Cosmos DB charges you for how complex the query is and how many reads it had to do. They call them RUs. And some of those reads could be quite expensive, so you don't want to do them over and over again. So typically, applications will do those expensive reads, and they will then set up some sort of caching mechanism. Well, now Azure Cosmos DB has that cache built into it, right? So they have something called the Azure Cosmos DB integrated cache, and it's an option that you can turn on for a little bit more cost. You get this special front end which caches some of your queries, and this way, when you make a request the second time, there's a cache hit. It just comes out of the cache, and you
Oh,
obviously
so
don't
that
pay.
doesn't hit your RU at
It
that
does
point.
not hit your
Oh,
RU.
I didn't get that
Yeah,
connection.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
that's nice.
So I mean, so there's a small charge for the front end this thing, but that's jump change, compared to how much you might pay on Cosmos DB costs. So,
Hmm.
and so that's a new feature that is now generally available. The second one is on the blob trigger for functions, which is something that has always been around, but it works in a polling mechanisms. So the function polls the the blob that you want to trigger on, and sometimes that can be a delay in that. Now what they've done is they've connected the blob trigger to event grid and event grid to functions so that you get
Hmm.
the trigger a lot faster, right? It's almost immediate, and so now that is currently available. That feature, the Azure functions with using event subscriptions. And finally, with app services, we talked about app configuration. I think we did a show on this just a few weeks ago, and there wasn't, an easy way to bolt on app configuration to app services or Azure functions. You still had to write code to read the app configuration. Now, in preview, they are starting to integrate the two services so that you just go into your configuration tab in Azure App Services or Azure Functions, where you would configure your environment variables. You can add references to app configuration directly there, and therefore, you can store all your configurations centrally and just pull it down. And for now, this is still in preview, and it's limited to just the non-secret type of configuration. App configuration has both secret and non-secret. The secret ones are backed by Key Vault. That's not there yet, but right now the integration does work for non-secret configuration in app configuration. So I think this is a very good thing for our applications that want to share common configuration and are hosted in app services. So those are the three updates I had.
Nice. Yeah, I've got two, and I'll have to confess, one of them, talking about ephemeral OS disks, using host-based encryption, right? There's customers that want to be able to encrypt, can't talk tonight, encrypt these disks. That has gone public preview, but the reason I wanted to I didn't want to call it out for that so much as I just wanted to remind everybody that ephemeral disks are ephemeral. That means your data can go away at any time. I've worked with many customers over the years that they sort of treat their ephemeral disks just like regular persistent disks, and it always comes back to bite them at some point. The other one, and this is really goes down sort of this availability concept, is that live resize for premium and standard SSD disks has gone GA. Again, what this allows you to do is to resize your SSD disk without having to take your server offline. Right? Historically, you had to do that to resize it. Now, if you need to make it bigger, or I guess theoretically you could make it smaller if you wanted to as well. You don't have to take anything offline. Your servers can stay online. So just sort of giving you higher uptime with the same functionality.
We still have to do something at the operating system level with that, Evan, or how's that work?
That's a good question because the OS doesn't.
Yeah, I would imagine something has to be done there. I work on a lot of
Yeah,
Linux.
you're probably right. You
know?
probably have to increase the volumes at that point. But I guess
Yeah.
you could just add new volumes on the existing drive space, right? At that point.
Yeah, I don't think it would be a reboot. Like
Yeah.
I don't
No,
believe.
I don't think it is either. Yeah. But yeah, it's probably. I don't think the OS is smart enough to just pick up the larger disk that's underneath it. So yeah, you definitely have to do that there. But yeah, so okay, so given that, so let's sort of move over to James at this point. James, as I sort of mentioned in the intro, you and I work together, but why don't you, share, who you are, what you do here at Microsoft. I love the CRE heart behind you. That is
Yeah, that's
awesome.
so. One of the guys wrote that up in the office, and I thought I'll leave that there. I had to check first to make sure what was on
Nothing
the
else on there.
whiteboard as well as that. But
Yeah.
that's the most prominent thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I've been with Microsoft for about 6 years now. In the CRE team for about 5. I started off the Sydney team. I was the first person over here on my lonesome trying to figure out what on earth we do in CRE, which is a lot, many varied spaces. And initially I focused on the communication side of things, the Azure Communications. I was very fortunate to be able to travel over to Dublin for a couple of weeks. we've got Michael Ryan over there, who's a fantastic lead and built that team over there significantly and has a real good insight into how communications work. And his team started initially the teams and the low code, no code solutions that we use for Azure Communications. And it started off with, basically we'll get an email from our system saying we're needed for communications on a call, and that Power Automate, or I may accidentally say Flow. It used to be called Flow. So I'll just
call it that.
Yeah, I'll excuse myself there because someone will complain if I don't call it Power Automate. It monitored that email address for a person to start with, and then a Teams post would appear in our channel that we use for our communications synchronization and conversations, and then we'd go from there. It was really basic, and the Teams post would be with a person's name on it and things like that. And then over the years, I've now taken that up and developed it quite a bit further, and we use things in Teams like incoming webhooks, outgoing webhooks. There's adaptive cards that give you a lot richer experience. We've put buttons onto some of those cards so that the actions in the Teams cards actually go and do some other things in the program and in the back end, and record some logs for us so that we can go back and track and things like that. And almost all of it is done by triggering a Power Automate or a Logic App flow. Even when you click those buttons, all it's doing is calling the URL for a flow to run and take the payload from Teams. And significantly, when you're working at low-ish volumes, there's not hundreds and hundreds per minute of calls that we get engaged in for comms. It's super easy to use. Things like monitor an email box and look for certain patterns and criteria, and then take actions with Teams and send other emails and things like that. Super easy to get started, and especially in a team where our focus is communications. We're not there to we're not technical people, we're not programmers, we're not developers, we're not engineers. And these sort of toolings, we need to be able to support ourselves in-house. And this sort of solution, just about anyone can get up to speed and have that global supportability if things break, with most of what we've done.
I think it's sort of ironic because you and I actually were working on a project the last week or so that plays into this. Is there's a set of emails that come in to some aliases that we need people to be watching for and respond to. These are sort of crisis related emails from some of our customers. And the problem we've always had is, whoever's on call is supposed to watch for it. But man, we all get up and go grab a bite, or, you go get some coffee or some tea or something, and you miss it. Right. And that's a big deal. And so you and I collaborated to be clear, you did all the hard work. I just sort of said, "Hey, James, did you do it yet?" But you took this email, you're able to convert it into a flow, and then now we're going to actually, page our folks automatically from this. Now they'll have to go then read their email and then respond to it. But now they can sort of be out and about doing whatever they're, doing whatever they got to do, and they'll still get this notice rather than having to sort of be glued to your screen. The impression I got from you was that was very easy for you to set up using Power Automate.
Yeah, look, over the years, we've fundamentally got a few base flows and monitoring that's working. And a lot of the stuff that we're now at a point where things like this, we can actually sort of bolt that on to what we've got, or fork out a different thread. And with Power Automate and Logic Apps, you can call other flows as well. So if you've got something that's already looking at a mailbox, you don't create another flow to look at the same mailbox. You put a condition or a switch statement that then just calls another flow that doubles down on that particular component.
You're sort of building the pieces, subroutines almost, in it's sort of a traditional parlance.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I've got a programming background, and that is exactly what you do. But that also means that you can then, for supportability and things like that, the person who manages exactly what that component looks like when it receives an email for a specific piece. And if they want to change the content slightly that gets pasted, or make some little tweaks, they can do that, and they're only impacting that component. The top level component that actually receives the email and then spins it off, that remains fairly static. And building it in that way also means that when you get to a situation where the volume gets too high, so we've had that with a couple of things with our engineering tickets. Power Automate and Flow, if you're trying to run hundreds or thousands per second or per minute, it's not going to fly. Like that's just
not really what it's designed for, right?
Yeah, it's not at all. But then being able to switch to use something like a functions app, and within the functions app, you can do all that brute filtering work and still call it flow afterwards. So if you go from something that's running, if you're running it receives thousands of signals, but only 1 in 100 needs to actually do something, but you need to monitor all that data coming through to pick up those. It's quite easy then to flip over and apply some fairly basic programming principles with something like app functions that can scale and can handle that volume, but it then only calls that flow, once in 100, once in 1,000 times. And then again, you keep the low code component, the people who need to manage that and change, little bits about what it does, that's all they need to worry about. They're still operating in that low code, no code environment without having to know too much about the app function that sits above it that's handling all the bulk, as long as they understand the principles of this is what it's looking for to trigger your flow. I've written whole websites that actually have flow running in the background. They're clunky and things like that, but it makes it really easy if you have to try and connect emails or Teams or pieces like that, that if you try and do from a pure code perspective with Azure Active Directory and all the integrations and trusted app services and all that sort of stuff, it gets really complicated really quickly.
James, is there some scenario where you have to connect to Azure Resources? You mentioned logs maybe, or other Azure resources as part of this Power Automate or Power app. And if so, how do you do that? How do you integrate with these Azure resources?
So, predominantly the biggest Azure resource that we use is Kusto or Data Explorer. For all our logging and telemetry and all that sort of things, I've really got on board with logging all that telemetry. It's what we use underneath all our Azure services to log all the telemetry that we need. There's lots of gotchas there. It's really easy to throttle Kusto really quickly if we've made lots of mistakes in that area. But that's a gradual process. But even Flow and Power Automate, and especially Logic App, that can connect to your Azure resources. It's got all that built-in identity pieces within your Logic App where you can define your managed identity that lets you connect to a key vault or even a virtual machine or things like that. It's from a customer perspective, it's super easy to actually look for an email to say start my VM and go and find the VM and start it for you from an email trigger. From what we do though in the live sites and communications, you've got your service health, and we send out the incident notifications for outages and maintenance and things. It is super easy to subscribe to that with service health events, and trigger your flows and save the data and do things more than just email someone or SMS something, which is built-in functionality. But if you've got, for example, 100 subscriptions, and you want to be able to have a consolidated dashboard, you can actually use Logic Apps to receive all those service health alerts for all those subscriptions that you can set up with a script across all of them, and they'll all go to one place. They'll all trigger the same Azure function or the Logic App, save it to a SQL, write it to Kusto, all those sorts of things that you can then drive websites, dashboards, all that sort of thing from.
Yeah, James, when you were mentioning the, I think you called it function apps, but so how do you kind of figure out where you're going to use the Power Automate side versus the Logic app? Sounds like some of the hardcore stuff, more heavy stuff you put on Logic. Is that the way to think about it, or?
So we started out with Power Automate and Flow. I mean and this has been a natural progression where we've developed ourselves and we've fallen into pit holes and we want to get better ourselves with reliability and our own alerting and monitoring. The biggest thing I've found reason to use Logic Apps is it's got the Azure built-in monitoring, alerting, runs failing, run latency going over certain amounts. You can configure that with your Azure Monitor and Azure Alerts, and that's built in so that you can send yourself emails and SMSs if your processes are failing. Whereas the Power Automate doesn't have that. It's got, it'll send you an email once a week and say, hey, 20 of your flows have failed this week. Doesn't help you in a real world situation where you're running processes that other people depend on. So, I mean, that was the real trigger for us to move to Logic App. We are doing predominantly now, most of our development is in Logic Apps purely for that reason. We keep getting to the point where, if this breaks, who knows about it? Who's going to fix it? You can't wait for people to start complaining that something's not working.
When I'm hearing you describe all those various tools that you're using, James, as a developer, I'm getting worried about the developer experience or the developer environment that I'm going to have to set up. Right, I'm already thinking okay, I'm going to have a Power Apps, whatever Studio, maybe a Logic Apps kind of editor, and then VS Code for functions, and God only knows what else. So, is there a silver bullet for all of this, or am
Look,
I not too far off from?
I mean, exactly what you've said is sort of the progression we've gone through and learnt our painful lessons along the way. If I was starting from scratch, Power Automate and Flow is fantastic to get started, to have a play, see what it can do, work out how connections and things work. Really easy to go through and do that sort of thing. Proof of concepts and things. But if you really want to try and push this to the next level, I would be looking at the integrated service environments for Logic App that lets you define your environment with how many virtual machines you want behind it and powering it and auto scale and things like that. If you're going to do things at scale, if you've just got a couple, then the pay-as-you-go consumption model's fine. This is again where we've been caught out, where all of a sudden you've got a flow that runs 100 times every minute and you're paying on the consumption, and all of a sudden someone taps you on the shoulder and says, do you realize your consumption's gone up just a little bit over the last few days? And that's where the ISE environment, even though it's a little bit more expensive to set up, you control exactly how much that's going to cost because it's a flat cost. You're paying for the virtual machines that are sitting underneath it. It also makes it a lot easier to set up your consistent alerting and monitoring because you do that at that whole resource level instead of having to do it granular and different at each time. So, I mean, if I was going to start off now, I'd say, as I said, Power Automate to start with, get used to it, play around, do things like monitoring your own email box, playing around with some rules to move things around to different folders, Teams integration, figure out sort of how it works, and those concepts are 100% transportable over to how Logic Apps operates. But the Logic Apps really gives you a lot more structure around alerting, monitoring, cost optimization, all those sort of things that you can control a lot better. And then, as you said, with the function apps and things, you've got to make a really careful decision when you move to that, because that's a big change. And the supportability that you need to have available to support anything like that means you need a base level of some coding experience to be able to support that. So and as soon as you do that, you start moving into, okay, how do we do our deployment chains, how CI/CD and source codes and all, that becomes a lot more important as soon as you make that big jump. And a careful decision again.
Yeah, I think the thing, James, that I thought was interesting about sort of the journey that you've been on, and we as sort of a broader team is on, is because, and I think you hit on it earlier, even though we were sort of joking, about who's developer and who's not a developer, right? That's such a murky term these days, right? But I think the reality is our job is not to sit around and write code, Our job is to run LiveSite, right? Our job is to send communications, right? And and so the ability to start small and do some of this testing really has been a big enabler for us. And obviously, you're doing much more advanced stuff, in a lot of cases, but we're still spanning the continuum today, right? As I look at what you're using and what the broader team is doing as well. And these are for mission critical things from our side. It's a big deal when our alerts don't fire internally.
Yeah, and look, it's super easy to fail fast and to
Yeah.
to make your changes and adapt and respond really quickly to things. I mean, there is a downside to that. Is if you build this sort of environment, that fast fail thing leads to organic growth, and organic growth means you end up in a place that's very hard to. How do we document this? It's organically grown over the last 6 months with people playing and adding things and these really great new features, but then you've got to go back and sort of try and keep it clean. So I mean, there's always a gotcha here, and there's always an absolute need for the rigor that comes with a programming background of how do I set this up, how do I structure this, how do I do even just access, permissions, security, all that sort of thing. You've really got to think about it. It's easy to break yourself into jail as well in some of these things. So you do need to have a little bit of oversight, and you don't want to go into it completely blind, even though it is really easy to get started. Even simple things like we were talking about calling other functions using the URL. You should really put some security principles in there. You should add an auth token when you send the request, and make sure you check that auth token at the other end, because you don't have to do that. You can just whack the URL in there, but you just got to remember these things are open to the internet. You've got to be careful.
Internet's a scary place.
Oh yeah.
Cool. No, this is great, James. Kale, Sajid, any last questions for James?
No, I think this has been an excellent primer on how to do low code, no code for some of these edge case scenarios that you described, James. And I think there's almost every company has a department like that, right? That can use. I mean, I think that's fair to say. Everybody has a need for something like that, and we typically string together some scripts or web pages with ugly code and whatnot behind it. When there's a much more elegant way to do it using some of the tools that you just described. So thank you for sharing that.
I was waiting to hear, James, that like when we're using Teams, that people were responding with emojis, and we had like custom emojis, like freakouts and stuff like that. That would be awesome.
Well, I've been playing around with the bot framework built into Teams, which is all in code. And the situation came up is, well, what if the bot pastes or creates a card or a chat that you don't want? And one of the neat things I did was if you reply back with an angry face to one of the bots, the bot goes and deletes whatever it was that you angry faced.
Oh, that's so awesome. I like that. That's
Nice.
excellent. That's excellent. I'm gonna start replying to angry face to everything, just hoping these chats that fill up my day, go away. Yeah, I mean, any last sort of guidance? I mean, you gave some really good guidance to people about sort of, start small, play around, learn, and then, in terms of the growth path. Any last sort of thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
Oh, look, the lessons I've learned is do some documentation while you're doing it. It's really easy to build these things, and it looks nice and simple with flows and diagrams and drag and drop. But as soon as you start, having modules and forking things off, things can get really complicated. And if you've got a programming background, it's actually really easy to make very complicated flows and logic apps if you apply that same program thinking, and other people will look at it and go, oh, I do not understand what you've done here. You've got loops and switches and conditions and things in there. So, do some documentation while you're going. If you wait until after you've done it with the organic growth, you'll find yourself in a world of pain, like I have many times.
Yeah, no, I think that is awesome advice, right? Because that is exactly the trap that everybody's fallen into, right? You sort of throw something together, and then later you're like, I don't remember how this is supposed to work, right? Much less show somebody else.
Actually, now that I think about it, James, can you write unit tests for this thing?
That's a good question. I don't know. For Logic Apps, I bet you can. I don't know if you can for Power Automate.
Yeah, it's really hard. The whole, testing environment, PPE progression, it's really hard to simulate when you get into this world. You've got to think about that up front. You can't retrofit any of this stuff. It is something to think about, but generally most of the teams or the folks that are looking at this, they don't want that. That's part of the rigor, and where they get stuck is, you go to your programming team and say, hey, I need this, and they tell you it's going to be 6 to 12 months before they can look at it. Because of some of those rigors. So, maybe what you're doing, if you need to look at unit testing and things like that, maybe this isn't the right approach, and you should actually be going to a more structured, programming developer team to do that work.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it is all really this continuum, right? There's no one solution to any of this. It's sort of what you need and what your business requirements are, right? And what your skills are as a team, right? If you got a team of a bunch of people that aren't hardcore developers, writing a bunch of code and unit tests is going to be hard. If you got a team of a bunch of developers, they're going to do that in their sleep, right? So no, that's a really good point. Okay, well, no, this is great, James. Always, it is so nice to talk to you when we don't have somebody on the other side of the phone yelling or screaming, or somebody, something's down somewhere. So it's very nice to see you in a positive situation. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
See y'all.